Okay, people are still coming in, so we'll give it just a little bit. Okay. Okay, this is great. We have a lot of people. People still coming in. Okay, so all attendees, please go to the interpretation button near the bottom of your screen and select the English channel. Okay, we got a few more people still coming in. All attendees, please go to the bottom of your screen and click the interpretation button and select the English channel. Okay, we're still getting a few new people. So we're going to get started. Everyone be sure to click the interpretation button and select the English channel at the bottom of your screen. And we'll get started. Good evening, everyone. My name is Dan Plotner. I'm a program coordinator with the Compliance Division here at the district. I will host tonight's meeting. Vicky and Gloria are providing Spanish interpretation. They will now provide instructions in case you need interpretation services. Okay, so yes, Vicky, we just heard those instructions, so in Spanish. So I think people, if they need those services, have probably switched over by now. So I think you're free to start translating. Okay. Thank you, Vicky. Welcome to the San Diego County Air Pollution Control District's public meeting to discuss emissions and potential health risks from welding operations. Please note we are recording this meeting and live streaming to YouTube. We have a presentation first, so we are asking that you please save any questions or comments until after the presentation concludes. At the end of the presentation, if you have a question or comment, please use the raise hand feature at the bottom of the screen if you would like to speak. We will call on you and allow you to unmute your microphone. You can also type questions or comments in the chat box. We will also respond to those after the presentation concludes. We have several staff members joining us for tonight's presentation, but we will begin with our Deputy Director, Mayani Luther.
Thank you very much, Dan. Good evening, everyone. I am Mayani Luther. I am one of the deputy directors for the district. I oversee the compliance and engineering division. I would like to thank you for attending this public workshop this evening. As Dan mentioned, we are here today to discuss welding operations and also to discuss how we are proposing to calculate emissions from these operations and as also establishing permitting requirements. We have, as Dan mentioned, we have a quick presentation, and at the end, we can hear your comments and questions. I will now turn it to Mohsen Azemi, who is our Chief of the Engineering Division. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mayani, and good evening, everyone. As Mayani mentioned, my name is Mohsen Azemi, and I'm the Chief of Engineering Division here at San Diego County Air Pollution Control District. Appreciate your time to participate in this meeting. And the purpose of this meeting, as Mayani mentioned, is to discuss welding operations and some of the emissions and the health risks that they could be attributed to the operations, and talk about how the calculation methodologies that the district has developed can be used to identify which operations need to get a district permit in accordance with our existing district rules and regulations. There are additional district staff present in this meeting, and I would just ask them that when they are doing a presentation of some of the slides to introduce themselves at that time. So if someone misses the original opening of the meeting, they can still see and know who they are. So with that, if we can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So welding operations involve metals that are fused together using heat. The way that is done is welding is a very common practice. It's used in many, many different industries. And at the same time, they can also create air toxic emissions that can increase the health risk, adverse health effects, which could be long-term or short-term, or could be cancer or non-cancer health effects. If we can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. There are many different types of weldings that are specific to the type of industry and the type of material or parts that are being welded together. Welding is generally done by what's called arc welding, which is a technique in which the metals are welded using the heat that is generated by an electric arc. However, there are different types of arc weldings, such as submerged arc welding, or SAW, which is frequently used in heavy structural construction or other type of industries to weld relatively thick plates together. There's also flux cord arc welding, or FCAW, which is a flexible welding process that's suitable for all position welding, providing high quality welding with good appearances. Another type of welding, arc welding, is called shielded metal arc welding, or SMAW, which is again used in construction, shipbuilding, and manufacturing. And it can be done in either indoors or outdoors to weld low and high alloy steels, such as carbon steel, cast iron, and nickel alloys. Another type is gas metal arc welding or GMAW. This is also known as metal inert gas or MIG, which is one of the most common welding processes and can be used indoors to weld materials that are in construction, automotive, manufacturing, and aerospace industry. And then finally, gas tungsten arc welding or GTAW. This one is also known as tungsten inert gas or TIG or TIG. And this is most commonly used to weld thin sections of stainless steel and non-ferrous metals such as aluminum, manganese, and copper alloys. We can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So electrical arc welding generates welding fumes that consist of some of the fine or small particulate matter and heavy metals such as chromium, hexavalent chromium or chrome-6, nickel, lead, cadmium, and manganese. And these pollutants can create health effects, and that's why we're talking about welding tonight. And a different type of welding processes that we saw in the last slide can generate different amount of emissions. And the amount of emissions and the nature of them will depend on, for example, how much fumes are generated, how much metals are in the fumes, what's the composition of the welding rods that are used, and how much of the chromium is converted to hexavalent chromium. We can go to the next slide. The district actually has been evaluating welding operations under the Air Toxic Hotspots Program or AB Assembly Bill 2588 program, which is a state law, since the 1990s. And the Hotspots program is intended to identify facilities that can create some elevated health risks, ensure that the public's right to know about those elevated risks is served, and then also require risk reduction measures from those facilities. And the map that you're looking at here shows the location of those facilities for which their welding operation has been already part of the Air Toxic Hotspots program and been evaluated by the district. Due to the potential elevated health risks evaluated from these facilities, in 2021, last year, the district issued an advisory to consider existing permitting requirements for welding operations, and then also use the data request to identify the existing welding operations. We can go to the next slide. This slide shows just part of that data request that was sent to facilities and displays some of the information requested by the district, such as the usage records, to more specifically quantify the potential health risks and make a permitting determination. Next slide, please. So this slide summarizes the outcomes from our data collected in data request that was sent out in 2021. We actually identified about 190 additional welding operations and 17 new welding rods that we did not have composition information on. As a result, then we went ahead and developed new emission factors for these new welding rods. And then during the process of developing these new emission factors, we also evaluated all of our existing emission factors to find out if we need to update any of the data based on updated new information. As part of that, and in consultation with California Air Resources Board, the district also utilized a study that was done by our Air and Waste Management Association, AWMA, that included some additional testing and data for conversion of chromium to chrome-6 to update our emission calculations. And then the updated emission calculations will be applied for emission inventory preparation and establishing the permitting requirements. You can go to the next slide, please. So as previously mentioned, the district identified about 190 new welding operations. And this map shows where these operations are located in blue dots. The orange dots that you see are the operations that the district had already been evaluating their welding emissions as part of the district air toxic hotspots program. And there were about 30 of those. So 30 existing ones, and we learned there were about 190 additional welding operations. And by the way, this map is available on district's website, and it is an interactive map. So I recommend for those of you, and I will show a slide, the last slide, to tell you how to get to the district website to go in and look at these different operations if you're interested. At this point, I'm going to turn this over to Johnny Lofgren, our supervisor for engineering division, air toxics, and inventory group. Johnny?
Thanks, Mohsen. Hi, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. As Mohsen said, my name is Johnny Lofgren. I am a senior engineer here at the district, where I help lead our toxics and emissions inventory team. I will be going over the calculation procedures used and review some of the differences between the new and historic methods. The district focused on two main topics when reviewing and updating the calculation procedures for welding. The first is the calculation methods used, and the second is the emission factor used within those calculations. An emission factor is a pre-established factor, which relates the amount of pollutant released to the amount of activity taking place. For example, the emission factor for welding is given in pound of pollutants per pound of rod consumed. Each rod has a set of specific emission factors associated with it, as each rod has an individual composition, as Mohsen mentioned earlier. This slide helps illustrate the different welding rod types used and quantified for emissions within San Diego County. On the left-hand side of the table, there are rods listed, which have been quantified before the data request and advisory, as mentioned earlier. And then through the collection of the data, the rods listed on the right-hand side of the table have been added, as it was found that they were also used within San Diego County. Next, so if we could go to the link at the bottom of this slide, we'll navigate to the district website where I will go over where to find the information for emission calculations. Great. This is the main web page, which lists different calculation methods used by the district. It's listed by activity. So if we scroll all the way to the bottom, we will see an area that's labeled welding. Perfect, yes. Here we have all of the materials related to quantifying welding emissions. The emission inventory instructions and learn more document describe how the calculation methods are created and how to report specific data into the EIS portal if the facility is required to do that. Next, we have background documents, including a memo describing the development of the welding emission factors. And if we scroll a little farther down, we can find the emission factor tables, which are organized by welding rod type. You can toggle between each rod type by clicking on the box. And finally, we've also included the historical emission factor tables there at the end for reference. Great. Thank you. So that's our website. We can go back to the presentation. Next, I'm going to go over some key differences between the old and new factors. Thank you. So as Mohsen mentioned earlier, the district reviewed several studies for inclusion into the methods, including local research and recent national studies. Studies and/or research which led to factors adopted into the new methods can be found under that background document I had just mentioned on our website. This table summarizes some of the main changes based on the district's review of the calc methods, specifically quantification of hexavalent chromium. The district applied a study conducted by Air and Waste Management Association, which included additional testing and data for chromium conversion ratios as seen in red on this slide. Generally, the new emission factors for hexavalent chromium are of the same magnitude or smaller than the historic values. The table also includes historic values compared to updated values for the fume generation rate and fume correction factor for various welding processes. And it can be seen there is little to no change between those. If you have any questions about the factors or what they mean, please refer to our online documentation. So that is all for the emission calculation procedures. And now I will hand it over to Jim.
Thank you, Janya. Good evening, everyone. I'm Jim Swaney. I'm a senior engineer with the district, and I help lead the group that evaluates the air toxic risks that businesses have. So as previously mentioned, the district is planning to apply the updated emission calculations to establish permitting requirements. And so we would like to review those permitting requirements, which have also been specifically discussed in the advisory that was sent out last year. District Rule 11, which covers what operations do not need permits, exempts welding operations that do not create elevated health risks. This provision has an exception for operations that began prior to November 15th, 2000, provided that the air toxic emissions from welding have not increased. Next slide, please. So since the permitting requirements in Rule 11 apply based on calculated potential health risks, the district created a tool to determine if certain welding operations may be expected to have elevated risks. The tool is available on the welding page on the district website, and it is an Excel spreadsheet that you will need to download and then run from within Microsoft Excel or Google Sheets in order to use. You enter the information about your operation, and the tool will let you know if you need to apply for a permit or not. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this is a picture of the input screen of the tool. You enter your information in the blue boxes on the left side. We do have an instruction sheet included to help you, and most of the boxes, all you need to do is pick from a drop-down list. The options for the rod and welding type correspond to what we have available in the emission calculation procedures that Janya just discussed. Once you've entered your information, under the box in the middle, the screening results and permit determination box, it will tell you if you need to apply for a permit or if you're exempt from permitting. So now I'm going to show a demonstration of that tool. Okay. In this example, we have input the distances to the nearest neighbors of the business, as well as the rod and welding type used, and the annual and maximum hourly usage of that rod. For this specific situation, no permit would be required as shown in the screening results box. Next slide. Now we're going to add another rod and welding type with its annual and maximum hourly usage as well. When added to the first rod, this combined operation now needs to apply for a permit. And again, that is shown in the screening results box. And now I will turn this back to Mohsen to cover the next steps.
Great, thanks, Johnny and Jim. So our next steps is for the district to first utilize this calculation methodology and apply it to different facilities welding operations. And then depending on the results of these calculations, identify which facilities welding operations are subject to permitting requirements pursuant to the District Rule 11. And then finally, the district will notify facilities which have been determined to be subject to permitting requirements and require them to submit permit applications to cover their welding operations. At this point, we would like to actually go to the next slide. But before we go to the final, which is the final slide, by the way, I just want to mention that the district will consider any site-specific information that a facility may provide to the district as part of providing their emissions inventory if such information has valid documentation and is more representative of the facility's operations. But the calculation methodologies that have been developed are intended to be used by the district for providing the permitting determination short of any other specific site information, site specific. And the district webpage that shows here contains all of the information that we presented to you today, includes that interactive map of the locations where the weldings takes place, the calculation procedure, and the welding permit screening tool. If you have any questions about that information that we presented today or how this may affect your facility, you're more than welcome to contact us and we will help you walk you through this process. You can email us at apcdengineering@sdapcd.org or call our main phone number at 858-586-2600. And we will ensure that your questions are answered. So at this point, we would like to provide the opportunity for the public to ask us any questions or provide us with any comments that you may have. And then I will ask Dan to help us to route you questions through. And thank you again for joining us and being with us this evening. We appreciate it.
Great. Thank you, Mohsen. So we still have plenty of time for questions, and we appreciate everybody staying late with us. If you have questions or comments, you can type those into chat by clicking the chat button near the bottom of the screen. And if you would like to speak and ask your question, click the raise hand button at the bottom of your screen.
Okay, looks like we have one question so far. Give me one moment to scroll up. It says, when did APCD begin using the new emissions factors? And can you tell us if additional businesses will be permitted as a result?
So the district, thank you for that question. This is our first public workshop. The district has just released the website and made it available. And we are planning to begin to use this information as we go through. So whether or not and how many new businesses will be requiring a permit hasn't been determined yet, but that is our intent. Yes.
Okay, second question from Caitlin. It says, there doesn't appear to be any new TIG emission calculation sheets. Is there a reason, and how will TIG be calculated?
I would like to defer to Janya or Allison to answer that question.
Sure. Yeah, I can answer, and then maybe Allison might need to jump in. So in terms of adding new rods, and by adding new rods, we mean creating default factors from the information that was provided. Those can be seen on the slide that was previously presented. And as you can see, the new ones that were added, there's about a dozen, and they fall within the different rod categories. Yeah, perfect. Thank you. So if they're not listed here, then they were previously existing. In terms of the calculation methods, I would definitely refer to our online documentation. The Learn More document goes into specific details on how to calculate emissions associated with each rod type.
Thanks, Janya.
The third question, will this presentation be available? There is a live YouTube stream, so you could locate this meeting on YouTube for that answer.
And I'm sorry, but the presentation, we intend to also post the actual slides on our website as well, so it will be available. Good question. Thank you.
Another question, when will this be implemented, and when is the due date to apply for a permit if needed?
So as I mentioned, response to an earlier question, the district has just released this website and our calculation methodology. So we're just beginning to implement this, and the permits will only be required once the district notifies a facility that they are subject to permit requirements. So there is, right now, there is no deadline, but after we make determinations, then we will notify the facility, and then they have certain time to apply for the permits.
And Mohsen, just to add to that, Stephen, if we can go back to the next steps, we are planning to apply these emission factors to the operations that we have identified. So we have about 200 operations. And then we will send out notifications with a permitting, whether or not to inform the facility whether or not a permit application is required. At that point, the facilities would have 6 months to submit an application to us. And so that's what, we had outlined here.
Thank you. The next question is, how can emissions control, such as fume capture systems, be accounted for in the emissions calculations screening tool?
That's
Thank
a great
you.
question. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Maini, now.
Well, I can just, give a general answer to this, but so Rule 11 established that we needed to conduct a permitting determination based on uncontrolled emissions. And the reason for that is because if a facility needs controls to decrease emissions, this facility should be subject to permitting requirements to maintain the control device. So, the existing rule establishes that for the purpose of permitting determination, we need to evaluate the operation without controls.
Thanks,
But if a
Maini.
facility without controls is, does not create elevated health risks, then, this facility wouldn't need a permit.
And the only thing I would add is that the reason for that is that we want to make sure that the facility's operation at all times does not pose any significant or elevated health risk, not just the moment we evaluated it. So if it had controls at the time we looked at it, and tomorrow they take those controls off, we want to make sure that that does not happen.
Thank you. Next question. Can a business be exempt from permitting via a full HRA ? Or will the district solely use the screening tool to determine the necessity for a permit?
I think that's same kind of answer as the question before, that the intent is that if the uncontrolled emissions are not causing any triggering any permit requirements, then there is no need for an HRA or anything, but the screening tool will be used to determine whether or not a permit is required. And then once a permit is required, the use of an HRA can certainly be utilized to determine what kind of requirements the facility may be subject to. So if they have controls, the permit would probably require those controls to be in use at all times, and the HRA can show that the risk is not triggered for any type of additional measures.
Thank you. The next question from Enrique, will only stationary welding operations be subject to permit, or will this also apply to operators that weld at offsite construction sites?
Maini, do you want to respond to that one?
Yes, Board Member Medina, thank you so much for joining us this evening. It will apply to all welding operations, whether stationary or portable. Although sometimes, portable operations, because of the nature of the operation, the portability, they can tend to have, less health risks impact as compared to stationary sources operations. But the requirement would apply to both.
Thank you. Question from April. Are all companies that have welding operations required to fill out that form? Are companies that have been welding for a long time going to have to get a permit, or are they grandfathered in?
Thank you. That's a good question. Actually, as far as permitting requirement goes, if you look at Rule 11, there is an exemption if the facility has been in operation prior to November, and I believe it's year 2000, and has not increased their toxic emissions since that time. So some facilities may be grandfathered in based on the existing rule language, unless the board decides to determine that language be changed.
Thank you. Next question from Jose and Gabby. Would this permit be good for a year?
All our permits, they expire after a year. So our permits are subject to these renewal fees. But, the permit wouldn't be changed unless the process is changed, unless the facility decides to change the operation.
Thank you. Next question. If a facility has already submitted 20 years of historical data and the district has determined and notified the facility that they are not required to submit an application for a permit, does the facility need to do anything further?
So if upon review of the data that has been submitted, if the district has not requested the facility to submit an application, then there is no requirements to file an application. However, again, if the facility's operations, as Miney was mentioning, changes, if they increase their emissions or something, at that time they would have to be reevaluated. There's the next question from Mark. Says, is there
Yes.
any consideration of, sorry,
Okay.
I jumped. Go ahead.
Okay, sorry. For Mark, is there any consideration of welding operations conducted indoors versus outdoors?
And the answer is no, because both operations, whether it's indoors or outdoors, eventually those emissions will get out into the atmosphere. And therefore, it again, as Miney mentioned, it's uncontrolled emissions that we'll be looking at for determination of permit requirements. But if a facility operates indoors and vents to a baghouse or a HEPA filtration system, certainly under the permit, those emission controls will be taken into consideration.
Okay, thank you, Michelle, and everyone. We will give another minute or so for more questions to come in. We have reached the end of our chat questions. Keep in mind, if you would like to speak and ask your question, use the raise hand feature.
Okay, looks like we have 2 more questions. From April, if we are required to get a permit, will the district reach out to our company that apply? How will we know that we have to apply or if we are grandfathered in?
We will notify all facilities if you need us to submit a permit.
So in other words, no news from the district means you don't have to apply for a permit.
Thank you. Next question from Derry. Can you discuss the source of the emission factors? How was the distance from a receptor taken into account?
Well, I'll let Jonia.
Yeah, I can answer the first question. So the source of the emission factors. So we used a combination of sources to develop these emission factors. And that includes AP 42, specifically section 12.19. We used the welding specific studies that we had mentioned. That was the data collection. And then we also used material safety data sheets, or SDSs, for rod composition. And so I would recommend looking at the document we have on our webpage called Development of Welding Emission Factors, as it goes into detail about each of those sources and then how each one was developed.
And also, Jania mentioned AP 42. For those of you who don't know what that is, that's EPA's, federal EPA's emissions factor document that has emission factors for many, many different operations.
And just to add to that, thank you so much, Jonia and Mosen. I just wanted to highlight something that was mentioned earlier during this presentation, and that is that the district has been quantifying welding emissions since the 90s, right? So we've been doing this under the Air Toxic Hotspots program. The change now is that as a result of this data request that we sent out in 2021, we identify additional facilities, and these additional facilities, reported additional rods. Welding rods. So again, we've expanded our emission factors, but this is not completely new because we've been doing this for a very long time.
And then I can address the second part of Gary's question. And the permit screening tool has a spot in the upper left where you would put in the distance to your neighbors, both residences and workplaces. And we have an instruction sheet with this spreadsheet that goes over how you would do that and what we look at. So that is taken into account in the permit determination.
Thank you. We have 3 more questions. Next one is from Andrew. It says, regarding APCD's changes to Chrome 6 emissions, how many studies were taken into consideration?
Jania, if you want to jump in, we did already mention a number of existing studies and tests that had been done in the past, and we've been using it since the 90s for site-specific or default values. And then we also mentioned the Air and Waste Management Association study, but there were other information that we took into consideration. If Jania, you want to explore and expand on that?
Yeah, I think that does cover it. So in one of the very first slides, there is a couple bullet points of what is taken into account when we're calculating emissions from these rods. And one of those is the chrome conversion of total chrome to hexavalent chromium. And so in order to review that, we looked at local research, which is listed on our website, as well as recent research, which is the AWMA study, which Mohsen had just mentioned. And so we reviewed all of those different sources of data, and that's how we compiled the newer conversion from chromium to hexavalent chromium as seen on our website. And I think that we actually have a link to that on the webpage.
Yeah, I just added a link to the chat to the website. We really wanted to promote transparency. We posted all the documentation to substantiate these emission factors. So we significantly enhanced the web page. So everything should be there. And if you can find anything, please contact us and we'll be happy to provide.
Thank you. Next question from Lydia. Will emission factors already established for the sites that have reported since before 2000 need to anticipate any changes to the emission factors currently used and agreed upon with the APCD if no weld rod changes have occurred?
Thanks, Lydia, for the question. And as I mentioned earlier, the district is open to accepting and considering any documented studies or established site-specific information that's more representative than what the district is planning to use. And as long as that information is valid and more representative, we will accept those. But we also have, like I said, we have some new data, new information that we will take those also into consideration.
Thank you. Next question from Sarah. Is the annual rod usage input into the screening tool an actual annual usage or an annual usage for a potential to emit scenario?
So for the purposes of permit determination, we are using the survey forms that provided annual rod usage information. Since these facilities are not permitted, it's really hard to even determine what the potential to emit is. So we will be using actual emissions information that we have been collecting. And if Miney or Johnny or Jim, you have anything you'd like to add to that, please feel free.
Okay, thank you. Next question from Massey. What type of permit conditions does the district envision for welding permits?
So again, depends on the welding operation. For example, if it is an operation that utilizes air pollution control systems, then the permit conditions will incorporate that requirement if we are to use the controlled emissions as the emissions associated with that permit. If it does not, then there may be no requirement for that. But if the emissions change, so there will be some limitation on their operation of existing operation. And if they increase those emissions or usages, then there may be a need to reevaluate that permit.
Thank you. Next question from Derry is, what are the projected costs for the permits if it is determined to be required?
I think Miney and Jim or Nick, or you guys have a much better handle on that.
Nick, Horace, I don't know if you have an idea, but what we can do is if we send a notification, we don't know exactly. I think it really is going to depend on the project, but we typically provide emission estimate or just fee estimates, not emission after fee estimates. And so we can provide that information once we make a determination as to whether or not a permit is required. Nick, do you have anything to add to this? Nick Horace is manages our permitting, one of our permitting programs.
Yeah, hi. So I'm Nick Juarez. Yeah, my group would be the one that would probably be reviewing, the permit applications eventually. And yeah, it's gonna vary a lot dependent on, the specifics of the operation. A more complicated process with a lot of different, welding types with higher risk is going to be more expensive than, a simpler process with lower usage. But just to give you a ballpark, a typical application we'd get for something similar is probably going to be in the like $5,000 range for the application. That's a rough cost. It could be less, it could be more, but just to give you a kind of rough idea.
Thanks, Nick.
Thank you. Next question from Lori. It says, is there a reason why American Welding Society specifications are not included in your evaluation and your data is limited to SDS and other sources? Can we cite AWS specs for weld rod composition?
Hi, Lori. I can answer that question. So most of the studies that are cited in the development document that I had mentioned earlier, including the SDSs, most of those include specifications from the American Welding Society and the numbers that they list in their evaluations. So although it's not listed directly, it's indirectly analyzed through the other sources that we mentioned earlier.
Thank you. Next question from James is, will HEPA filters be required to be installed as TBACT for permits above a certain risk threshold?
Thanks, James. And again, we are going through this evaluation first to determine who would need a permit. And once that permit is submitted and evaluated and issued, if there is an increase in the emissions from that source, then those increases will be evaluated for our toxics rules. And if the risk of increasing emissions is more than 1 in a million cancer risk, for example, then yes, there will be some additional controls such as best available control technology for toxics required to keep the risk below permittable levels. But again, it depends on the type of operation and their emissions initially.
Thank you. Next question is from Mark. It says, since determination for permit applicability is made on uncontrolled emissions, are risk factors updated based on presence of actual management practices and controls which reduce emissions and associated risk to public/workers? Will permit list calculated risk values?
I'm not sure I understand the very last part of this question, but again, the determination for permit requirement is based on uncontrolled emissions, but permit that will be issued depending on what the company or the facility or the operation utilizes as controls. Those could be whether it's air pollution control equipment. I know that the Cal OSHA or federal OSHA has certain requirements. As long as those requirements are controls that would reduce the emissions that are released into the atmosphere, not just protecting the worker and the area around the worker, then yes, those will be considered as part of the calculated risk values once the permit requires the use of those controls.
Okay, thank you, Mohsen. Mark, if that did not answer your second question, please post in the chat or use the raise hand. And for everyone else, we still have time for questions and comments. We love both of those things, so feel free to ask away. I just posted a link to our YouTube channel in the chat. You can use that to rewatch a replay of tonight's webinar.
If you're not watching an NBA game or something.
We'll give another minute or so for more questions to come in.
We have a question from Lori. It says, Janya, if we specifically reference an AWS specification in lieu of an SDS, will this be satisfactory? Also, the current EIS system only allows a reference for SDS. Can option for AWS specs also be added?
Yeah, so I can answer the first question, and then for the EIS question, I'll touch on that, but definitely reach out to me outside of the meeting and we can go over EIS. So for accepting values that are not the default values that we've listed online, as Mohsen mentioned earlier, if they are site specific, and we're given sufficient information to review those and approve them, then we can use those in emissions inventory. For using EIS, I am aware that it does say SDS for upload, although there is a general location where you can go and upload other materials for review. And I would definitely use that to upload any information you'd like us to review for emissions inventory.
Thanks, Janya.
Okay, we're gonna start wrapping things up here. I put the link to YouTube in the chat, and if you search YouTube for San Diego APCD, that is our channel where you can find a replay of this. There's information on our website, and our contact information is on the screen right now. So you can always reach out to us with questions about your specific circumstances. I don't see anything else in the chat or any raised hands at the moment. So I'd like to thank everybody.
Sorry.
We do have one more. Okay.
Yes, from Neil, it says, are the recently published new factors considered final or subject to change or additions?
These factors were developed with a lot of studies and evaluation. However, we always open for new information. So if you would like to submit anything to us for our consideration, we absolutely were receptive to that. And also, as most mentioned before, we certainly consider site-specific information, testing results or, testing for rod compositions and things of that nature. So we want the emissions to be as accurate as possible. So, just reach out to us, even if after we make a permitting determination, if you want us to consider anything, we are certainly receptive to that. And then I also wanted to mention that our contact information is also available. This is the general information, but you can also contact us directly if you would like. And we really appreciate you taking the time. We know that these meetings are difficult to attend in the evening. So we really appreciate your time this evening. And with that, I think that we are ready to end the meeting. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone, and be in touch. We will love to hear from you.